Good evening. I am Xavier Salomon, the Deputy Director and Peter J. Sharp Chief Curator at the Frick Collection in New York. Welcome to this 49th episode of Cocktails with a Curator. It's been a year that we've been accompanying you from the Frick Collection every Friday evening during this year of this world pandemic with stories about great works of art and focuses on great paintings and sculptures and pieces of decorative art from the Frick Collection. Of course, we've now reopened in our temporary new home, Frick Madison. We opened last week and we're now open to the public. And coming to Frick Madison, as you see in this image, you will see a lot of old friends under a very different light. Here, of course, is a grand Italian gallery with the Allegories by Veronese and Pietro Aretino by Titian, all works that we've covered in Cocktails with a Curator. But on the left, you see some paintings that are somewhat less known, like the Guardi, one of the two Guardi views, which are usually hanging in the reading room of the Frick Art Reference Library. And next to it, you see a portrait, a pastel, which is actually a brand new addition to the Frick collection. There are a number of works at Frick Madison that have been acquired in the past year and a half, and that are on view for the very first time. And this pastel and its pendant are going to be the focus of tonight's talk. So coming to Frick Madison, you will be able to see some new additions and alongside old friends. Because we are almost at the 50th episode of Cocktails, I'm going to drink tonight one of the most famous cocktails of all time, and actually one of my favorite cocktails of all time. You all know, of course, the British spy character James Bond, 007, and in all of the movies, he famously drinks his vodka martini, shaken, not stirred. But in fact, that is not the real drink of James Bond. The real drink for James Bond is called a Vesper, or a Vesper Martini. And this comes from Ian Fleming's first novel, which created the character of James Bond, Casino Royale, which was published in 1953. And in one of the early scenes of that book, Bond orders his famous cocktails. A dry martini, he said, one in a deep champagne goblet. Oui, monsieur. Just a moment. 3 measures of Gordon's, 1 of vodka, half a measure of Lillet. Shake it very well until it's ice cold, then add a large thin slice of lemon peel. Got it? Certainly, monsieur. The barman seemed pleased with the idea. Gosh, that's certainly a drink, said Leiter. Bond laughed. When I'm concentrating, he explained, I never have more than 1 drink before dinner. But I do like that one to be large and very strong and very cold and very well made. I hate small portions of anything, particularly when they taste bad. This drink's my own invention. I'm going to patent it when I can think of a good name. And of course, later in the book, he meets Vesper Lind, one of the first of many women characters in the Bond books and movies, and he names his special martini in honor of Vesper, and that's why this is called the Vesper Martini. Cheers. I still think this is the most delicious martini you could imagine. Now, of course, the Bond movies, Sean Connery and all the great actors who played this famous literary character are always focused as well on the great female characters. All the great Bond women that accompany him, his secretary, Moneypenny, and of course, most recently in the movies, M, also played by a female character. And I'm linking it here with the works I'm talking about tonight, also because this month, March, is Women's History Month. And during Women's History Month at the Frick and at the Frick Art Reference Library, we've been doing a lot of programming about women artists and women art historians, trying to focus on some of these characters in history. And the 2 pastels that I will be talking about this evening are by one of the most famous female artists who lived in Italy in the 18th century, Rosalba Carriera. We all know that, of course, in Western art, but this is also true of art from pretty much the rest of the world, women have not been as well represented as they should be. And this is for a number of reasons to do with the way in which society worked in the past And I think we all need to look back at that and understand that to make sure that obviously these are not mistakes that we make in the future. And of course, the world is changing, has changed, still needs to change. But it is wonderful to be able to focus on extraordinary snippets of history where there are extraordinary human beings, in this case, a woman like Rosalba Carriera, who change very much what is happening around them. Rosalba Carriera was one of those artists who was so famous in Europe and that she was known by her first name, Rosalba, Mrs. Rosalba, and everyone knew who you were talking about. She was born in Venice in 1673, the daughter of a lawyer, the granddaughter of an artist, a rather mediocre artist, and her mother, Alba Foresti, was also a celebrity in Venice at the time because she made very beautiful lace. And of course, lace production was associated with Venice at the time, now also, of course, with the island of Burano. And Alba Foresti was one of the most famous lace makers at the time. The couple had three daughters. Rosalba, her full name was in fact Rosalba Giovanna. She was born in 1673. 2 years later, another sister with the same name, she was also called Rosalba Giovanna, but known as Giovanna, was born in 1675. And in 1677, the third daughter, who was Angela Cecilia. And of course, the Carriera parents brought up these girls, educated these girls. They learned their mother's trade. They produced lace. But Rosalba also, together with her sisters, trained as a painter. And by the early 1700s, she was a very good, very well-known artist already, working in Venice and for an international market. And she was also extraordinary because she ran the family business. She ran her father's business to begin with, and after her father's death, she actually ran the household with her mother and her sisters. Here she is in a fairly early self-portrait, where she's shown painting her own portrait, and this was given to the collection of the Grand Duke of Tuscany, who collected at the time self-portraits of famous artists, and is now, of course, at Uffizi. Here you see Rosalba again on the left in a much later self-portrait as the grand painter she was towards the end of her life. This is now in the Royal Collection in England. And on the right, this satirical caricature, rather harsh as an image, but also meant with a lot of friendship and humor by one of her closest friends, Anton Maria Zanetti, who was a great connoisseur at the time and who supported her throughout her life and produced a series of scathing caricatures of all sorts of artists and singers and people in Venice, male and female. And in this book of caricatures, among them, there is one of, as he says here, Signora Rosalba, Mrs. Rosalba, friend of the author. And so he is almost imitating a typical Rosalba portrait, showing her with a necklace around her neck with this sort of extraordinary hat, but also showing her in really not very flattering terms. And this is clearly a joke among friends. Rosalba became very well known, of course, for her pastel portraits. She became the preeminent artist in the field in Europe in the 18th century. But she actually started her career as a miniature painter. So she would produce small paintings on ivory sheets. This is one of them at the Cleveland Museum of Art, which shows a woman at her toilette. And these were sometimes portraits, sometimes allegorical or mythological scenes, often little pictures of women with somewhat erotic undertones. And of course, by nature, a miniature is a very small object. And so these were kept as lids of boxes or were worn by men and women in a number of different ways. And so her early career is very much about miniature painting. But already by the early 1700s, she is made an academician at some of the most preeminent academies in Italy, the Accademia di San Luca in Rome and the Accademia Clementina in Bologna. And in the 1720s, she actually becomes a member of the Académie in France, in Paris. All of these academies allowed women to join, but of course this was a very rare occurrence because of course they were run by men and it was fairly rare that they would allow their female colleagues to join. But Rosalba was so famous and so beloved by the great painters of the time like Maratta in Italy or Coipel in France that she joined these academies very early on. She lived in Venice for most of her life in this house. And this is on the Grand Canal, exactly next door. What you see, the white building just to the left, of course, is what is now the Peggy Guggenheim Museum in Venice, in the parish of San Vio. And this was Rosalba's house, where she lived with her mother and her sisters, and where she worked and where she entertained visitors from Venice and from all over the world. She became so famous that every French and German and British traveler to Venice would invariably make a stop to Rosalba's house and studio to sit for her and bring back a pastel portrait to back home, or even sometimes, obviously, miniatures. She was just as famous as her contemporary. Canaletto, of course, was producing great views of Venice for the same group of people. Rosalba's pastels, and she really sort of moves from miniature to pastels, again, fairly early in her career in the 17 teens, are extraordinary and are extraordinarily beautiful. This is probably one of the most beautiful pastels she ever made, of an unknown lady with a parrot, possibly an English woman, we're not entirely sure. This is at the Art Institute in Chicago. And here you see really the extraordinary use of pastel, the colors, the different textures between the jewels, the fabric, the flowers, the feathers of the parrot, the skin of this woman against a fairly neutral background. Rosalba herself often, it seems, didn't really know who some of these sitters were. Her diaries and her letters are often full of references to things like, I started a portrait of an English blonde man, or I started a portrait of an Englishman with dark hair. I started a portrait of an Englishman who has a wounded leg. And so clearly she was a place to stop where many people went and where she produced these portraits almost in industrial quantities. Her sister Giovanna helped her and often produced copies of celebrated pastels that Rosalba had made. But she also made much more somber images, like this wonderful portrait of a Dominican nun, which is in Venice still at Carrezzonico, a huge contrast, if you think about it, to the previous portrait. Rosalba was, of course, very interested in the female world of Venice, and she never married. And her sister Giovanna also never married. They lived together, as I said, but they also were surrounded by younger women who trained with them as artists. And so you can see how her female sitters are often represented in more sympathetic and more interesting ways. But of course, she lived in a world which was dominated by men, and so many of her grand pastels are images of celebrated men. This, to give you just one example, is the portrait of Horace Walpole, the famous writer and collector who lived in England, but who was also portrayed by Rosalba in this wonderful pastel. In 1720, Rosalba went to France, and it was pretty extraordinary, again, for a single woman to travel and an artist to travel across Europe and be invited to work in a different country. And between 1720 and 21, she moves to Paris and lives with the collector Pierre Crozat. Of course, she doesn't travel alone. Women at the time had to be accompanied by men who would guarantee a safe travel. And she goes, of course, with her friend Anton Maria Zanetti, who made the caricature of her that we've seen earlier on. But she also goes together with her mother, her two sisters, and at that, around 10 years earlier, more or less, her youngest sister had married the painter Giovanni Antonio Pellegrini. And so she traveled with her sisters and also with her brother-in-law. Crozat was at the center of Parisian society and Parisian culture. And in Paris, Rosalba, for example, meets, portrays, and becomes very good friends with Antoine Watteau, the painter. And here is Rosalba's portrait of Watteau now in Treviso. And of course, there is a sense of sadness in this portrait, and especially for us who know that Watteau would just die soon after this portrait was painted at a very young age. But she also portrays the king. And the king, of course, is Louis XV, who's still not of age. So, of course, the court in France in the 1720s is under the rule of the regent. This is the period of the regency in France when the Duc d'Orléans is running France on behalf of the young Louis XV. And Rosalba's diaries from this time, we have a number of diaries and letters by Rosalba, more almost than any other Venetian painter at the time. give us a very interesting sense of her work in Paris. She's clearly working nonstop. She's portraying everyone from the king to contemporary artists to a number of aristocrats, French and from other countries. And she constantly records who she's portraying and what she's doing. She's going to the opera. She's going to the ballet with her sisters and her mother. But the diary entries also give us some fun snippets into what happens at court around that time. And these are very interesting vignettes into the life at court. So, for example, in June 1720, on the 25th of June, she records, "Went with my brother-in-law to finish the king." So she went with Pellegrini to the royal palace. "The king, who suffered 3 small accidents. His gun was dropped, his parrot died, and his dog fell ill." And again, on the 28th of January, 1721, "The Duc de Noailles, brother of Madame de Louvois and captain of the Royal Guard, had a terror of cats. The king, knowing this, scratched him from behind, imitating a cat. The Duke fainted and hurt himself, and the king cried." So these sort of wonderful little stories of what is happening at court. But also there are moments when you really get a glimpse of this sort of workaholic woman. So much pressure is on her, clearly, and she's trying to perform in this male world and trying to work on her art and satisfy all the clients that are asking for these portraits constantly. So there are little moments in the diary, like the entry of the 14th of October, 1720, when she just says, "It is a sad day for me." And Rosalba, we know, suffered from depression on a number of occasions, and all this work seemed to have sort of pushed her forward while struggling with quite a severe depression. These are the 2 pastels by Rosalba, which have been given to the Frick collection, bequeathed to the Frick collection last year, and that are on show at Frick Madison for the very first time. And these are wonderful examples of Rosalba's art. We know, unfortunately, very little about them. We don't know when they were painted exactly. These are probably painted anywhere between the 1720s and the 1740s. It is quite difficult to date Rosalba's pastels because her way of painting pastels, of portraying people, is fairly similar throughout her career. So it's difficult to make a big difference and tell the difference between them. We also, unfortunately, do not know who the sitters are, this man and this woman. And we also don't know, even though they have pendant frames, we don't actually know if they were meant as pendants to begin with. We don't know if the frames are original. They seem to be 18th century frames, but they're probably not necessarily the original ones. So there may actually be 2 individual portraits of a woman and a man done even possibly at different times that later on were then put together as pendants. But because, of course, we don't know who the sitters are, it's very difficult to tell if these 2 sitters, if these 2 human beings were connected to one another in any way or not. These pastels were part of a bequest last year of Alexis Gregory, a great connoisseur and collector here in New York City, who founded Vendôme Press, a great publishing house for art books. And Mr. Gregory passed away last year and left to the Frick almost 30 objects, mostly decorative arts. But in this group, there were the 2 pastels by Rosalba. And because Rosalba was not represented at the Frick previously, we're, of course, very thrilled and happy and honored to be able to show these 2 pastels and represent the art of Rosalba at the Frick. And the pastels are hanging at Frick Madison together with the work of some of her contemporaries, with the work of Tiepolo and the work of Guardi. The female portrait, of course, is typical of Rosalba's portraits of women. Here is an elegant, very beautifully dressed woman, somewhat provocatively attired. Of course, her dress is sort of rather low cut, but you see that the decoration of the dress and this beautiful sort of voluminous blue drapery is decorated with jewels and with flowers. And of course, there are more flowers on her hair and these large pearls, pearl earrings on her ears. The details of both the pastels, of the flowers, of the jewels, of the textures, of course, are typical of Rosalba's great works, and of course have to remind us of the fact that Rosalba trained as a lace maker. The man, instead, is dressed in a rather peculiar outfit. Again, elegantly dressed with a blue jacket embroidered with flowers and a lace cravat, but he also wears a black cape hat and this stick, which is actually a pilgrim staff. These were the walking sticks that pilgrims used to go to pilgrimage, and the black cape, of course, is also associated with the idea of pilgrims. Rosalba painted a number of figures in fancy dress, and the one on the right is actually one of my favorite ones in Dresden. Dresden has one of the largest collections of Rosalba works, more than 150 pastels by her, because the king of Poland and the Elector of Saxony at the time was a great patron of Rosalba and a great collector. And this, again, is a portrait of an unknown sitter, possibly English, maybe German, dressed in a Turkish fashion with a Turkish turban and drinking from a porcelain cup, probably chocolate or coffee. So what is this fancy dress of the man in the Frick portrait? Was he really a pilgrim? And of course, patrons did go on pilgrimage. On the right, I'm showing you an example of the patron of a large Veronese painting, painted a few hundred years earlier, now at the Prado, which shows possibly a member of the Contarini family, we're not really sure, who is dressed as a pilgrim with the pilgrim staff and the black cape. But it's also inscribed with the 5 crosses, the red crosses of Jerusalem. And we know that this man must have gone in pilgrimage to Jerusalem. Our pilgrim in the Rosalba painting has none of these insignia. And of course, if he had gone to Jerusalem, you would have the crosses. And if he had gone to Santiago de Compostela, you would probably have the scallop shell. So is he really a pilgrim? Or is it to do with his surname? And what I'm showing you on the right is a self-portrait by Pellegrini, who was Rosalba's brother-in-law. The Carriera family, of course, was very close to the Pellegrini family, and Pellegrini in Italian means pilgrims. As you can see, the man in our portrait is clearly not the painter Pellegrini. They look rather different. And also, I think the status of this man is clearly a different status from that of a painter. And he is clearly an aristocratic, wealthy man. There were noble families, a family from Verona of the Pellegrini family. And there were, of course, other families, the Pilgrims, for example, in England, or the Pèlerins in France. So could this be a joke on this man's surname? Or is the portrait relating to a French fashion? And of course, I mentioned how Rosalba was very good friends with Watteau. Watteau created this whole iconography of pilgrims of love. His great Fête Galante, and here I'm showing you a detail of one of them, show elegant aristocrats, men and women, dressed as pilgrims with pilgrim staffs, going to pilgrimage to the island of love. And so is this Rosalba's homage to her friend, whom she knew well, and she presumably knew his work as well while living in Paris? Or is it simply a costume? Is it simply a carnival costume? And the hat, in fact, the tricorn hat, is usually associated with Venetian costume and Venetian carnival. And Rosalba painted a number of sitters. On the right is an Irish sitter dressed up for carnival in Venice. The one on the right is the Rosalba Pastel at the Metropolitan Museum. And so it could be equally true that our pastel actually has nothing to do with a French iconography, with a surname, or with a real pilgrimage, but it is simply a carnival dress. And this may be true because there is another pastel by Rosalba. Actually, the location of this is currently unknown. I only know a black and white image of this. But you see that this other young man, elegantly dressed, also has a cape, a black cape, and a pilgrim staff. So unless these two men were somewhat related, maybe they're brothers, we don't actually know. And we don't really know who the sitter on the right is either, or as I say, where this pastel is. But clearly, Rosalba did this more than once. And so it may simply be a costume and a relation to visitors to Carnival in Venice. Now, this portrait, when we examined it recently, revealed a rather interesting surprise. Here you see the back of the male portrait, and you see how it is mounted, the paper, on canvas and on a strainer, which is a form of almost like a stretcher, an early version of a stretcher in wood. So it is really constructed like a painting. And here you see the back of it. And as we were examining it only a month ago, we realized that in the top left corner, between the strainer and the canvas, there was a little piece of paper tucked behind the canvas. And we pulled the piece of paper out, and you see that it was a folded piece of paper, which once unfolded proved to be a printed image, what is known in Italian as a santino, a little sacred image, which shows a medallion with the Virgin and Child and the three magi, and a dedication on the right to the three saints in Latin. The saints, the three Saint Magi, Gaspar, Melchior, and Baldassar. Of course, those were names that were given to them in the early modern age. And you see on the left that out of the three kings, one is kneeling in front of the Virgin and Child, one is on the right, one is on the left next to the star that leads them to Bethlehem, and the one on the left, of course, is an African man. And it was always believed that one of the three kings, Baldassar, was from Africa. The little text says that the three kings should pray for us now and in the hour of our death. And then in Italian, it adds that the three magi of Cologne, for the grace of God, would preserve travelers from the bad hours of travel, headaches, epilepsy, fever, witchcraft, and any sort of malefice and sudden death. And the magi were connected at the time to the city of Cologne. And what you see at the bottom of the image is a view of the River Rhine in Cologne. The great medieval cathedral of Cologne was said to host in this wonderful gold shrine the relics of the three magi that were brought to Germany in the Middle Ages and kept in Cologne. Now, why did Rosalba or anyone else hide this object inside the pastel? And we have actually evidence that she did this on a number of occasions. We have a letter from Pier Caterino Zen, who was a nobleman in Venice, to Anton Francesco Marmi in Florence, written in December 1729. And Zen writes about Rosalba's distinct devotion to the three kings, who brought themselves to the adoration of the baby Jesus at the grotto in Bethlehem. Once she gave me a certain portrait to send to my brother in Vienna, and she gave me a little card of the three aforementioned adoring magi, and said that to these she entrusted the safe outward journey of the portrait, adding that whenever such little images had accompanied her pictures, they had always arrived safely. The image, of course, is particularly wonderful for us at the Frick because it shows the Rhine in Cologne, which is the subject of a great Turner painting, of course, painted more than 100 years later, but that is the same image. And we now know that Rosalba added these little santini, these images, to a number of her works. They have been found in a number of works in Dresden, and here I'm showing you the portrait of a famous singer, opera singer from the time in Dresden, which on the back you see glued onto the back of the frame, the same or very similar religious image of the Magi. And these accompanied these pastels in their travels. More have been found in pastels in the Royal Collection in England and also at the Louvre in Paris, and more, I suspect, are still hiding behind the stretchers and inside the frames of many other Rosalba pastels. But what is wonderful for us is that this is really this moment. It was very moving for me to be able to touch this piece of paper, which was probably last placed behind the stretcher by Rosalba herself. And I keep imagining how she would have imagined that one of her pastels, well, in this case two, would have ended up in New York City several centuries later. This is Rosalba's grandest late portrait, self-portrait, showing herself as Winter. And this is to remind us that this successful and wonderful woman also ended her career under rather tragic circumstances. She lost her sister Giovanna early on in the 1730s, followed very swiftly by her mother. The only one who survived was her youngest sister, even though her husband, Pellegrini, also died before Rosalba. But in the 1740s, Rosalba started to lose her sight. She had problems with cataracts, and she underwent at least 3 very painful operations, which helped the situation to some degree. But from the late 30s, mid 40s, she effectively stopped working And she went around 1750, 51, she went totally blind. She spent the last 7 years of her life in absolute darkness in the house at San Vio. And this affected, of course, also her mental health. And we know she was very depressed about this. And you can imagine this woman who had traveled to the French court, subsequently had also traveled to the court of Vienna, the imperial court, and a number of other places, an independent, forceful woman and a great artist. Losing her sight must have been one of the worst things that, of course, one can imagine for a person like this. And she died in Venice in 1757 and was buried in the little parish of San Vio. So when you come to the Frick collection and you come and visit Frick Madison, have a look at these two wonderful pastels and think of the extraordinary career of Rosalba Carriera. And I hope you're all enjoying your Vesper Martini. We haven't really talked about spying or anything to do with James Bond, but this has been about some secrets and about an extraordinary woman. And I raise a glass to Rosalba and thank you all for following me this evening. See you all next week.